everyone. Thank you very much for having me. It's very, very cool to be here. I've been to a couple of Angular Connects, but this is the first time I've actually presented, so that's pretty cool. This is my talk called Mocking Made Easy, but that doesn't really mean too much. The probably more literal title we can take here is making your applications easy to test and run locally so you don't have to spend loads of time messing around with really annoying data mocking solutions and can just focus on actually writing your applications. Yeah. Rolls off the tongue really well. And those are the sort of titles that I give to conferences and meetups so I can give this talk. I think the really cool title for this is definitely Mocking and Glocking. It's really hard to find a picture of an actual solid gold gun or house, so just had to improvise there. Anyway, I'm Dave, and I am a software developer at OVO Energy, and I really like open source stuff. Really like testing, really like mocking, which you're about to find out, and you'll probably be sick about hearing about it after this. But anyway, really, really quick disclaimer. I've got massive baby brain. I've got a 5-week-old daughter who's just here. If I could just quickly be really, really cringe and get a little photo up on stage, and we can all be collective like, ah. There we go. Thanks. Excellent. Okay, cool. Let's actually cover something that you paid to come for. Cool. So I want to talk to you guys about testing and running web applications locally, specifically mocking and how we do it and what I think the problem is. And I'll probably hammer home a few different points over the course of this, but I really think this is a topic that's been stagnant for quite a while. So I've sort of tried to think about things a little bit differently, and I want to sort of explore some of our current sort of mocking solutions and what I think a slightly different way of doing this is. And you can form your opinions and let me know how much you love or hate it afterwards. But anyway, running a web application locally on your laptop, whether we're developing features or improvements or trying to recreate bugs or, in my case, cause bugs, that should be a really painless process. And being able to test all the different paths that your application can take, whether they're happy or unhappy experiences, that should also not be a pain. If you need to do any sort of mocking, or if you feel like mocking is appropriate, that should also not be a pain. And whilst all of this is happening, your application state, it needs to be able to bend to what you want it to do and sort of be able to maintain the integrity of the data that you're working with. And what we're referring to with happy and unhappy paths here, I'm sort of referring to things like, your user is signing up to your application, they can do that successfully, or if they need to make a payment, they can do that, etc. And you can see there as well some things that aren't quite happy paths, customers in debt, payment failed, unable to retrieve records, maybe your server's thrown back a 500 or whatever. And I'll probably interchangeably refer to happy and unhappy paths like that, or refer to them as scenarios as well. So just to give you the heads up on that. This should be pretty easy. I'm sure internally you're all groaning because it's not. A lot of places I've worked and a lot of projects I've looked at, it's not really that easy. If I sort of come up to someone and ask them to bring up a customer in a particular state, maybe they're in debt, or maybe there's something a bit weird or funky about them. Usually people have to tweak around with the database, or they're pulling stuff from somewhere they probably shouldn't. And it kind of sucks that that's just not a snappy sort of thing to be able to bring up entities in those particular states. So I guess we can quickly explore how we typically see this being done. So you could run your application against a production service. If you do that, you will get sent to developer jail. That's a pretty sort of cardinal sin, I guess. Some people do it. I mean, I've done it in projects before. It's a bit naughty, but in developer jail, you've sort of got to argue about tabs versus spaces and Vim versus Emacs and what the best language is. It's obviously TypeScript. We could run our application against a staging or UAT service. Cool, so we're not touching customer actual live data now, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately, you'll also go to developer jail if you do this, because typically you're accessing data that's on shared instances, or maybe if you're accessing something that's coming from a database, the schemas are out of whack, or you don't have the right data in there that you want. So that's still not really great in my opinion. We could start to go down the containerization route and run everything against a local copy of our production services or staging services. And that's also sort of starting to head in the right direction. But unfortunately, it's still a little bit of a pain, and you might go to dev jail. Getting these things set up is typically an afterthought when you're setting up a project. You're not really thinking about Dockerizing literally everything and getting that all nice and polished so you can work offline or work, wherever. So I'd probably, I still sort of shy away from that when I can. But we've all heard of these things being done before. I've already admitted that I'm guilty of doing these sorts of things. I'm sure 95% of you are also guilty of it. They are sort of our go-tos. Some of you are also probably thinking, why don't we run a mock server? Great, okay, we're starting to get into some cool territory. We can definitely do this. There's so many options out there. You've got things like JSON server, Node mock server, API mocker. That number I've got down there is probably pretty close to how many alternatives there are actually on NPM if you have a look. Alternatively, if you're not familiar with any of those, or you might not have too many endpoints in your application, you might just roll your own local API. Maybe just write a small node service to serve up some data. If you've only got like less than 10 endpoints, that's also feasible. None of those are bad solutions. And that gets you there for most of your use cases. Especially if you're starting something from scratch and you're sort of building up, rather than getting too tricky, you can do that. A really quick example here is what a config looks like for JSON server. So for those of you unfamiliar, JSON server basically allows you to define a JSON file. It's keyed by the endpoints that you want your application to serve up. And then the values there are just the responses for when you hit those endpoints. So here we've got post, comments, and profile, and you can see the respective responses. That's pretty cool, and it's incredibly popular, so I'm definitely not discounting that. I went to start writing an example for API mocker, and I got a little bit annoyed because there was so much config. So you can take a look at that yourself. The problem that I find with things that start to get a little bit more complex, like API mocker, is that it's pages and pages of JSON configuration, and then you start to introduce things like JSON path to define different scenarios. And for those of you unfamiliar with JSON path, it's like XPath, except 600 times worse. Yeah, it's not great. But anyway, what else can we do? Cool. All right, so now we get to the fun part. We have a little library that I wrote called Datamocks. And my fiance came up with this logo one day, and she said, Dave, I created this logo for you, and it combines two of your favorite things. Beards, obviously, and ransom letters, which I thought was a little bit odd. And someone asked whether it was giving or receiving, and then I got even more confused. But yeah, anyway. We've got Datamocks. It uses a code-driven config, so that's nice. You're not writing loads and loads of JSON. It doesn't interfere with your existing code base, which is really cool. And it's similar to Angular multi-mocks, which actually Ed, who's in the audience here, he wrote that. But it's a framework-agnostic version of it, which works with everything, like vanilla JavaScript, Angular. Didn't know if I could use the R word, so I've sort of redacted a couple of things. So we've got blank and blank native. So you can probably work out what those are. It works with XHR and fetch, so if you're working with something a bit more legacy that uses XHR under the hood, or even something really popular, like even still today, like Axios, that still uses XHR under the hood, or something a bit more new that uses the fetch API, it works with both of those. It's super quick and easy to set up, which is what we're about to find out. And it supports scenarios, which is my favorite thing about it. And it's the thing that I think really sets it apart. So let's jump into some coding, which hopefully this doesn't go too badly. Let's jump out here. I can still see everything fine. So what I have is a very small Angular application, and it's a little widget factory, which is super contrived, I know. But all this is doing is it's fetching a bunch of widgets from a node service and then displaying them. So here I have 10 widgets. And for, I guess, context here, a widget is just an object that contains an ID. So we've got some sequential IDs here. And we've got a little button up the top which allows us to add a new widget. And my application doesn't work quite as you'd probably expect. It doesn't retrieve something in sequential order there. It retrieves a widget with an ID anywhere between 1 and 100. And basically, this application was built to handle certain types of widgets. And I guess we could pretend that these things are a little bit more complex. Maybe they have different categories. Maybe they behave differently depending on what sort of widget is being rendered on the screen. But maybe there's also other things. Maybe there are unsupported widgets. Or maybe there's invalid data coming back from our server, or any of these sorts of things that we can't necessarily predict. And when we're developing this application, we want to be able to make sure that we've actually coded this correctly. And sometimes that can be a little bit difficult. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into our application here. Hopefully we can see this okay. Is that big enough? Yeah? No? Okay. Just shout out if you need it to be bigger. So basically, you've probably all seen this screen before in your Angular applications. I've just imported a little random number generator that I wrote just so I don't embarrass myself trying to generate random numbers in front of you all. And what we're going to do here is first we're going to mimic what my node service currently does so that we can get the same behavior. And then we're going to introduce scenarios and just see how easy it is to be able to toggle between these. So I'm going to kill off my little node service that I've got here. So that can go away. So now I don't have a working application. So what I can do here is, first of all, I need a way of, an entry point to be able to inject my mocks into my application. So as we've all probably seen before, we have a little if block here that says if it's environment.production, then do something for prod mode. Similarly, we're just going to say if we're not in production, environment.production, and we're going to do some stuff here. So we need to import a couple of things. First of all, we'll import a function called inject mocks. Cool. All right. So we can add that code here. And we need to give inject mocks some mock data to actually, and tell it how these mocks should behave. Fortunately, that's pretty easy. So let's define a variable of scenarios. Now this is all fully TypeScript supported, so we've actually got typings for our scenarios. So we can do that, and we can type that as scenarios. And all, I guess, this set of scenarios is a mapping of a scenario to what we want our mock data to look like. And the minimum requirement for a set of scenarios is that we have a default scenario. So here, I'll just quickly jump over to our entire application here. We can see that we're calling two endpoints. We're calling the widgets endpoint to get a list of all of our widgets, and we're calling a new widget when we want to get a new widget. So first of all, let's have a look at what a mock looks like. So there are only 5 things that you need to describe a mock with data mocks. One of them is URL. So it's just a regular expression matching on the endpoint that we want to mock out. So we've got widgets. The next thing is the HTTP method that we want to mock for that endpoint. And lastly, for the set of required things, is the response that we want. So I think we probably want an array of 10 items. Let's see if I can remember how to do this. And we want the IDs for them, and we want to return an object from them. And we probably want to do that. And I think that will probably do that for us. And the 2 optional things that we can also define for each of our mocks is a delay in milliseconds. So we can sort of make it simulate as if this request is really hitting a HTTP server, which is nice if your application's got things like loading spinners or loading animations and stuff. So you can sort of see that in action. It gives you a good look and feel while you're doing this. And then lastly, we've got a response code, which is just the HTTP response code. And that's it. So we can do that for all of our endpoints that we have here, and we should be in business. So we'll also do it for new widget, and the method is get. The response here is a little bit different to the one above. I've got that rand function that I imported before, so we'll just make it return 1 widget with a random ID, and we'll make the delay for this 2,000 milliseconds, and we'll keep the response code. Response code at 200, and there we go. All we need to do now is pass through our scenarios through to inject mocks, and that should work just nicely. Let's get rid of that semicolon. The other thing that we can also explicitly pass through to inject mocks is the name of the scenario that we want to run as well. So we'll explicitly tell it to run the default scenario for now, even though it'll implicitly run that if you've only got one scenario anyway. But hopefully, if I've done that okay, I should be able to come here, and I'll reload the page again, and you can see I've got that exact same set of functionality, which is really cool, and I can click Add New Widget, and it waits a couple of seconds, and now it gives me a random widget. Yay, we've got that. Cool. But that isn't particularly useful for anything other than a happy path. So I want to just sort of disclose a little bit more about my application. Super contrived, but that's okay. In the template for this, actually, we're considering any widget whose ID is greater than 100 to be a dangerous widget. And we haven't actually seen this behavior yet, but we've already written the code for it, and we probably want to see it in action. We might want to write tests around this later as well. So we need a way of being able to simulate that. So what we can do is we can keep our default scenario, because that's like our happiest use case of our application. And let's define a new scenario here. We can call it whatever we want, but we'll call it bad widget. And what we're going to do here is we don't need to rewrite all of the mocks for everything, because we're only really concerned with when we get a new widget, what happens when it's a bad widget. So all we'll do is we'll write a new mock for new widget, and it will be forget again. And instead of responding with something that has a random ID, we'll respond with something with an ID of 101, and we'll see what happens. We'll keep the delay and response code the same. Cool. So what we've got here now is just as I said before, we need to tell inject mocks what scenario we want to run. And I can show you something that makes this a little bit cooler in a second, but for now, we'll just run bad widget. And we'll come over here, and this is going to get pretty ugly, because a bad developer wrote this code, and oh no, we have a really dangerous widget now, and it doesn't look good, and something's gone wrong, and we need to fix this bug. And I guess, like, obviously, you could imagine this a more real-world case, you know, what happens when the data isn't what you think it's going to be, or that there is a bug. But yeah, I think you can sort of see what I'm getting at here. But one thing that is a pain is I don't want to have to go back into my code every single time I want to change scenario and tell data mocks to run this scenario. So fortunately, I've written a little helper function, which is called extract scenario from location. And what we can actually do is pass through the window.location object through to it. And now we can save that and come back into our code. And you'll notice that when I click Add New Widget here, this will just run as normal through our default scenario. But what we can do in our browser is through the query string, if we specify a specific scenario that we want to run, in this case, we've got bad widget. I'll just zoom in a little bit there. When we run this, instead of getting our default scenario, when we click Add New Widget, we now get back to getting our dangerous widget. And that's quite handy, because now I don't actually need to go back to my browser, back to my code and work out what scenario I want to run. I can just run it straight from my browser, and that's nice and quick and easy. But I'm just finishing off work. Unfortunately, I don't have it here to demo, but a Chrome extension which works out what scenarios are available and just allows you to toggle between them within a nice, pretty Chrome extension. So that's quite cool. So sort of keep your ears peeled for that. But we'll just jump back in here. And I guess I've sort of shown you something that is quite handy for, you know, we're developing features, we're fixing things, we're improving things, and maybe the endpoints for these don't exist yet. So you don't, even if you wanted to, you can't even hit a running endpoint for this. And we can mock out those responses. But I think that stuff like this can really do a bit more than that for us. When we're running things like UI tests, to test like the integration of certain things that don't require, you know, network activity or sort of like, I guess, third-party services that absolutely must be called. This is a really nice solution for that as well, because you can run different scenarios in your integration tests, and you don't need to hook up anything else into it. Obviously, tools like Cypress also have fixtures that you can run, and you can have mocked routes for that, which is really cool. And I guess if you're leveraging that, there's no need to leverage this. But sometimes it is nice just to leverage one set of mocks. Like, for instance, if I go back to my code real quickly, we've got all of our mocks in this this main.ts file, but we could abstract this out into a separate mocks file, so we're not sort of polluting our bootstrap code here. And then you could share that set of mocks between this and your UI tests as well. But that's obviously entirely up to the developer what they'd like to do for it. So I guess I've been talking a little bit about the things I think that are really great about this. I guess there still are some things that this is lacking. Because we're intercepting the HTTP requests before they go out of your browser, nothing appears in your network tab, which is a little bit of a pain if you want to debug the order in which requests were executed in, and a load of other stuff like that. So I think that I probably still need to add some logging middleware into that, or accept a pull request if anyone's interested in that. It's probably quite a good one. Things like simulating paginated data. I know a lot of the other sort of competing things also do that. And it doesn't have GraphQL support yet. I've sort of been thinking a little bit about that, but I think it's going to require quite a lot of thought there. I also need more people to test it. I'd love for just even if one person were able to go out and have a look at this. I do think it's a really great way of handling this sort of way of being able to develop code. It's really quick and it's really easy. And it stops you needing to rely on either someone or yourself writing a working endpoint, or even just the pain of having to write pages and pages of JSON just to get your mocks up and running. I guess just concluding, I don't really think that this is a silver bullet solution. There are trade-offs. You can't, at the moment, you can't ensure that the mocks that you're providing are of the right type that your endpoint is also providing. I am also working on something that will take in something like a Swagger or a RAML specification to ingest that and ensure that the mocks that you are writing fit those specifications, which is pretty cool. But as I said at the very beginning of this, I really do think that this is a stagnant topic. Almost everyone I speak to, when I ask them what they do for working locally, they either pull data from staging or prod, or they'll use some JSON-based mocking solution, and I still don't think that we're quite there yet. We haven't really progressed in the ways that certain other facets of web development have been progressing this decade. So I guess I just think that it would be really cool just to get more involvement in this problem space at the moment. There are some useful links at the end of this talk. There's a few underlying libraries that I really leverage, and I wouldn't be able to make this possible if it weren't for that. I'll put out the slides for this on my Twitter and all of that. But yeah, that's basically it, guys. Thank you very much, and please clap and cheer very loudly.